Oh, hi there, welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. So in this video I'm going to take a look back across all 5 seasons of Noah Hawley's Fargo to consider what it's all about and why I think it's so good. Now, Fargo is one of my all-time favourite TV shows, and one of the reasons for that is because it's entertaining, but it's also so rich in meaning. And of course, each season has its own theme and story, but what I'm going to discuss here are the threads that I see woven through the show as a whole. So without further ado, number 1, it's a case study on the relationship between crime and capitalism, but in a specific American context. So if we look at the 5 seasons in entirety, we can see that it's a study on the key turning points in recent American history and how each of those pivotal moments has then shaped American capitalism over the past century, and how that in turn has changed the nature of crime over the same period. So over the course of the 5 seasons, chronologically, we've got season 4 set in 1950, right at that turning point from a modern to a postmodern society. We've got season 2 then set in 1979, right at the onset of neoliberalism, Reaganism, or whatever you want to call it. Then we've got season 1 set in 2006, just before the great financial crash. Then in season 3, we're in 2010, following the great financial crash. And of course, most recently in season 5, the show looks at Trump's America, set in 2019, as the capitalism that we knew and understood has effectively ended. And then each season we see how these pivotal moments in American society impact on individuals, families and communities. And within that, it then looks at crime and capitalism and how they're intertwined. So in season 4, set in 1950, we effectively see the end of the small family-run business play out on screen. So the needs of the Irish American, Italian American or African American family are subordinated to the needs of business. So in this instance, we have the boy Satchel Cannon, so Mike Milligan as a child, being traded to a rival crime gang to ensure smooth business operations. And that was a particularly interesting season because we saw on screen how it was a distinct American version of capitalism. So Gaetano Fadda, the young brother from Italy, he says at one point, business, family, country. And he has this objective truth and reality, and there can be no deviation from that. But for the second or third generation Italian Americans, they understand that that's not always best for business, and so they adapt accordingly. And then the difference between the two outlooks captures a key moment in American history as they transitioned from this essentialist understanding of the world to this new postmodern era where there is no objective truth and where everything can be subordinated to the needs of business. And then another defining moment in terms of that process is, of course, in season 2. So we see the Gerhardt family in that season, an old German-American family-run mafia organisation. They're being bought out by Kansas City, the new corporate crime organisation. And Joe Bullo of the Kansas Mafia sums it up perfectly because he says, management says acquire the property, we acquire it, whether that's cash down or sending bodies to the morgue. And it highlights this new paradigm in American capitalism where every single thing can be boiled down to a 1 or a 0, and where the processes that were started in the 1950s have now progressed to. So then in season 1, just before the financial crash, I think we see a foreshadowing of what's to come in terms of financial ruin for ordinary Americans. Because in that season we have Lester Nygaard, who can only get ahead in life after committing murder by becoming a manipulator and a fraud. And of course he is mirroring Lorne Malvo in that season because the emphasis is on being an animal. There's this idea that everyone is just fighting for resources. And Lord Malvo, he even says to Lester at one point, there is no we, there's only you, which is just an expression of this logical endpoint of capitalism. Everyone is a self-interested actor with no regard for anyone or anything beyond your own interests. So then we move into season 3, post-financial crash, and we see the end of capitalism essentially playing out on screen as VM Varga sets out to asset strip the American public realm. So in that season, Stussy Lots car parks, it can be used to wash vast sums of money and create paper wealth beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And of course, that's the logical endpoint of that earlier corporatization of business that we saw in season 4, 1950, and then in season 2, 1979. And then finally, in the most recent season, season 5, I think we get a sort of Gramscian analysis of where we're headed. So we essentially get a look at what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called morbid symptoms, where basically the old order has died, but the new order hasn't yet been born. So in that season, we see the rise of these armed militias, typified by Roy Tillman's North Dakota Sheriff's Operation. And then we see the rise of the barter economy. And we also see this attempt to take us back to a sort of pre-postmodern era as women are subjugated and the family firm is back in vogue. And so, that season in particular, it's a creative look at our direction of travel and the narrowing of our collective outlook. And of course, all of that's done at the macro level. But then what Fargo also does so skillfully is that it marries the big picture analysis with how individual people interact with and make sense of those changes. So it captures the bewilderment that arises when rapid change is imposed on people. So then number 2, Fargo is also a really good critique of the American dream. Now, as I just touched on, Fargo, it marries this system level analysis with individual case studies. And what I think it highlights so well is essentially what happens when you've got systemic decline, but then you've also got a society which continues to tell people that they can achieve anything if they just work hard enough or smart enough, which is basically the essence of the American dream. And through its characters, it shows how hapless individuals are pushed to engage in petty criminality or other ludicrous capers to get ahead. But of course, each one of those ludicrous capers then has unintended consequences for that individual and also for the people around them. So a couple of good examples in brief. We've got the telephone salesman in season 2 who ends up being buried alive after getting into bed with Rye Gerhardt. We've got Ray Stussy in season 3 who tries to steal his brother's stamp. And then of course we've got Leston in season 1 who gets into bed with Lorne Malvo to cover up his wife's murder. And the skill of the series for me is that it explores American decline and how that impacts on individuals, families and communities, and then it highlights the lengths that people will go to be seen as a success or to give themselves an advantage. So it explores self-determination and ambition within a context of systemic decline. And then I think the show also really skillfully explores the class system. So as a British person, the class system is heavily entrenched here. It's talked about often and you face it every day. But what I found quite interesting about Fargo was that the series also explores class within an American context. So as an outsider, I always tend to think that America is painted as this classless society where anyone can get ahead. But I think Fargo sort of puts pay to that lie, really. And that's because the series, it explores class boundaries and people's perceptions of their own place in the social hierarchy in the class system. It essentially asks, what are people willing to do to improve their lot in life? How are they going to go about that? And what forces keep them down or in their class? And again, a good example of that is Ray Stussy in season 3. He's a probation officer, so he's a professional person, and he'd probably have a decent enough quality of life on his wage. But the issue arises because he's comparing himself to his brother, who is part of the new rich, and who got ahead in life due to a particular stroke of luck. And so within that season, we see Ray's ludicrous attempts to level the playing field and then his inevitable failure. And of course, we see that deadly combination of incompetence and ambition. But then we also get to look at people's choices within such a system. So in that same season, we see Gloria Burgle, who is also a middle-ranking professional, in this case a police officer. She has all the same constraints as Ray, but she chooses not to take the easy route. She chooses to remain true to her principles. And then we see the end result of that as she cracks the case in that series, despite the almost insurmountable obstacles in her way. And what's sad about that storyline, though, is that Gloria's example shows that just being normal, decent, doing the right thing, it becomes almost impossible due to the systemic forces in the way. She faces a constant battle from her own police department who always want to take the easy road. And so it's just a masterful case study about why the American dream is a con. Perhaps it's always been that way, perhaps not, but it certainly is now. And then number 3, I think the show also highlights the importance of social constructionism. So for me, the show takes a social constructionist view to identity formation. It explores the stories that we tell ourselves and why. It explores whose stories are told and whose aren't. And it also explores the nature of truth. So in essence, social constructionism is a sociological theory which suggests that our understanding of reality is shaped through our interactions with other people and with the world around us. And it looks at power relations and who gets to create reality within society. So every single episode starts with that statement, this is a true story. But as they ask across the different seasons, who gets to determine what's true and whose story are we seeing unfold on the screen at any given time? And then to make this concrete, I'll give the example of season 3 again. So that season, it opens in East Germany in the late 80s. We know now with the benefit of hindsight what a ludicrous system late-stage communism was, but the opening of episode 1, it depicts this state apparatchik undertaking an interrogation of someone and essentially defining what is true and thereby dismissing the huge weight of evidence which suggests otherwise. And the interrogator, even says at one point, are you suggesting that the state is wrong? And so then the show juxtaposes that authoritarian, corrupt and deeply flawed system against the US in 2010 post-financial crash, where we've got this sort of cancerous form of hyper-aggressive capitalism that dictates what happens to ordinary people, which distorts the truth and which crushes anybody that it needs to in the pursuit of profit. And the message, of course, is that if your story doesn't align with the powerful forces that govern our existence, you can simply be sidelined, silenced and crushed as needed. And in that sense, it's very similar to late-stage communism, which is a damning indictment, really. And of course, that story is told over and over again across the 5 seasons. Ordinary people are basically just fodder for our economic system and don't have much, if any, agency. and the message is that their stories are simply not told. So then number 4, it looks at the importance of dominant discourses. So for me, the show is absolutely superb at picking apart the dominant discourses of each time period. And I'll give a couple of examples here. So in season 2 in 1979, we have this shift towards greed is good, economic and social liberalisation, the move towards individualism, and this diffusing of family and social bonds on the altar of economics. And so in that season, we actually see Ronald Reagan, the godfather of neoliberal economics, in the toilet with Lou Solverson. And that's quite poetic when you think about it in terms of neoliberalism's legacy now. And then also think about Peggy in that season, and her drive towards self-actualisation. There's this idea that she was rejecting the status quo and this notion that women were going to have it all. But what I really liked about Peggy's storyline was that the dominant discourse of the time was for women to have freedom, but the show really picked up on the hollowness of that freedom and of the women's lib movement more generally, because in reality, that freedom was simply just freedom to become a more efficient consumer and for women to become a more integral cog in the capitalist machine. So, look back now with the benefit of hindsight, what did women achieve through the women's lib movement? Was it the right to go out to work for poverty pay? The right to provide informal care to children and elderly parents whilst also going out to work? Or was it the right to get a divorce and struggle while parenting on your own? None of that is freedom in any sense of the word. It's all an illusion when you look back now. And then, of course, think about season 5. It picks up on this retrenchment back to male-dominated ways of thinking and this rejection of liberalism, identity politics and feminism. Of course, the dominant discourse in Trump's America is just brute force, isn't it? It's a return to unrestrained masculinity and a rejection of woke ideology and a rights-based society. But again, what the show does so well is it highlights the flaws in that dominant discourse. So consider Gator Tillman, Roy's son. So he's a young guy with a large amount of power, which he wields to devastating effect in that season. But underneath all the bravado and the swagger, all we really see is a little boy in his father's shadow, desperate for love and support. And I suppose it's sort of an allegory to the manosphere, I guess. So, we have this guy who's outwardly confident and arrogant, but inside he's craving for meaningful connection and love. And that's, of course, what we see at the end of that season. Dot shows Gator compassion, and we see how all the arrogance and the swagger just drains away. So the show, it gives us this snapshot of the dominant discourses of each time period, but it then analyses what's underneath that, and it highlights how shallow it all is and how these discourses are used to maintain privilege and status for some people at the cost of other people. And so in some ways, I think Fargo is also a case study in what Chomsky would call manufactured consent. Each season explores people's belief system at a given period of time, and then it explores what economic or cultural forces underpin those beliefs at that particular moment in history. So then number 5, Fargo is also unapologetically political and woke. So for the reasons I've mentioned, I'm going to suggest that Fargo is a deeply political piece of work because of its analysis of American capitalism. But I think it's also got more overtly political as the seasons have gone on. And looking back now, that's definitely the case with seasons 4 and 5 in particular. So in season 4, we explored race in American society. And then in season 5, we looked at American society through a feminist lens. And of course, in the current political climate, everything outside a very narrow worldview is considered woke or Marxist. But this is the importance of art, isn't it? It's there to challenge dominant discourses and explore important themes in a creative and thought-provoking way. And of course, these days, woke is generally used as a pejorative, but really it just means being aware of injustice in all its forms. And that's essentially what Fargo explores so well. What are the forces in society that keep ordinary people down? And consider season 4 here. Loy Cannon, the African-American mob boss, he develops the credit card in that season. And of course, in hindsight, it's a rancid development within capitalism. But what the show emphasises is that even within capitalism, which is held up as this sort of colourblind ideology in which innovation is always rewarded, the colour of your skin is still a barrier to getting ahead. So Loy Cannon in that season, he's stuck as this criminal mob boss outsider, while the rich white bankers get fat off his invention. And so that storyline was a particularly powerful example of the systemic racism and oppression that exists in American society and within capitalism. And so number 6, and finally, Fargo also looks at the importance of randomness. So despite all of the class analysis, systemic analysis and systems that govern us, sometimes shit just happens. So in season 4 we see the tornado, and in season 2 we see the aliens, and that's just to give 2 very brief examples. So Fargo is also adept at highlighting that sometimes bad stuff can just happen to good people and vice versa, and there isn't necessarily always a sense of justice or fairness to what happens to us in life. And that's just a nice reminder that not everything can be analysed and put in a box. So there we have it. That's my retrospective analysis of Fargo seasons 1 to 5 and why I love it so much. So for me, it's up there with the top TV shows that have ever been produced. And I'm really hoping they come back for season 6 soon. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my breakdown of Fargo's main themes and ideas. I've touched here on what I took from the show and some of the key themes that jumped out to me. But what did you make of it? What did you think were the key themes across the show or within each season? Please let me know in the comments. And as I said, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.